So thank you to the University of Central Florida, to John Berzia, to the Florida Department of Health, and the Orange County Health Department. I learned a lot about the Florida Department of Health as they were working me over at lunch, and I nervously watched them put a lot of tomatoes from the salad in their pockets. So, but I'm ready. I'm pretty quick. I keep mistaking professors for students, and to me the real worry will be when I mistake professors emeritus for students. Then I'll know then I've been around for a while. So, your environment, my environment, a fight for survival. Actually, I think of it almost more of it as a challenge, a technological, political, and ultimately spiritual challenge. Just to sort of set the stage, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the mythologist, the late mythologist Joseph Campbell. He wrote, yes, I see some hands. Campbell wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. His study of world mythologies came to several core conclusions. One of them was about how in pretty much prehistorical societies, young men, actually boys, needed to go through an initiation rite, a mortal challenge, a mortal threat. And if they survived that, they would reach manhood. This did not typically in these cultures affect women the same way because childbirth provided a very real version of that. So there was always something of a made-up one for men to initiate them in the rites of being sort of good human beings. So I'm going to come back to that later, but I just want you to think about that for a minute, that kind of hero's journey, that kind of quest. So the setup here, global warming, there was some amazing presentations this morning, most of which I was able to sit through, having gotten here in time. And just a little background on Greenpeace. We're 36 years old. We started by opposing the atmospheric nuclear tests. We went on to oppose the dumping of hazardous waste, nuclear waste at sea, fight for the ancient forests around the world, whales, seals, the world's oceans. We've sent submarines down to the deepest canyons in the ocean to document the creatures that are there, to demand protection. And now a massive effort. We've been involved in the fight on global warming for 15 plus years, and a major push on global warming now. So global warming. Ultimately, it's about the burning of fossil fuels and this molecule, a number of molecules, but one, the carbon dioxide, naturally occurring molecule. I'm exhaling it now. But when we burn fossil fuels, we put a disproportionate amount of these into the atmosphere, and it traps heat. It traps heat like a blanket, because that energy from the sun is supposed to hit the earth and come back, and enough of it is supposed to be captured in the atmosphere to give us this great home, Earth, and to provide some stability, some climatic stability. And what we've done is thrown a couple extra blankets on this and trapped not just heat, but think of energy. We're trapping energy, and that's what can supercharge things like the weather cycles. So to put that in perspective, really probably one of the greatest climate scientists in the world is Dr. James Hansen from NASA. He's been tracking this rise in carbon dioxide for his whole career. It says we're probably only at a safe, stable place when carbon dioxide parts per million are between 300 and 350. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an amazing, robust body of scientists from around the world, from academia, from corporations, from governments, and it is something of a consensus body. They've said, well, maybe 400 is safe. And so, well, where are we now? We've been doing this, as somebody said earlier, changing this since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Well, in 2006, we were at 377. We're currently at 384. And James Hansen says we should be maybe at 350. So we're in the danger zone. It's not like global warming is coming. It's here. It's begun. But I think Hansen wants us to think of it more like cholesterol. Don't give up. You don't give up when your numbers come in bad, but you think, what the heck am I going to do to get this back down? And there's a lot of things you do. There's plenty of confusion out there on global warming. ExxonMobil alone has spent more than $15 million just in money that we can track funding skeptics, but not funding real scientific skeptics, because scientific skepticism is actually a good thing. Scientists do this to each other all the time. They put their theories out there. They actually willingly put their theories out there, and it's called a peer review process. They want their peers to poke holes in it because that's how they learn. That's not what I mean by skeptics. I mean ExxonMobil and others, the coal industry, the auto industry, having paid people to act like scientists, paid people to pretend they have more expertise in the field of the climate than they do, to confuse the public, to emphasize the uncertainty. And by God, there is lots of uncertainty in climate science. No more uncertainty than in most of the things you operate in and deal with on a daily basis, whether it's about eating nutritious meals or not smoking or not driving, or making sure you wear your seat belt when you're driving. There's uncertainty about the risks of doing that, but we try to favor good behavior, smart behavior, safe behavior. So these front groups took advantage of our, well, we didn't really want to believe in global warming. It's kind of inconvenient. It gets in the way. And it also played well for journalists, because journalists, they just like to stay out of trouble generally, and they want to say, well, on the one hand, 1,500 of the world's best climate scientists say global warming is here, it's now, and it is in part driven by human-induced behavior, burning of fossil fuels. Oh yes, and there's 3 scientists over here in the pay of Peabody Coal, Edison Electric, ExxonMobil, and they don't believe it's happening, but when pressed, they thought if it is happening, it'll be good for us, with no scientific backup. And that is the essence of the journalism, mainstream journalism that happened on global warming for the last 15 years. So if you wonder, why were Americans, we've caught up now, so far behind our European counterparts in understanding global warming? There were a number of reasons, but the main one that we could see from our research at Greenpeace was that we suffered the vast majority of propaganda from the fossil fuel industry that was designed to confuse us and delay action, which led us to the Bush years. Now, Greenpeace is completely nonpartisan. Nobody likes us in Washington. I have a great dog. They say if you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. I got a dog that looks like she's right out of the Muppets. She greets me with a great wagging tail, runs around through my legs every day when I get home. That's because nobody likes Greenpeace in Washington. We have to leave Washington to meet people who like what we do. But the Bush years have been a wasteland. They have been a wasteland when it comes to a lot of issues, and in particular on global warming. So, global warming, 2007 tied 1998 for the second warmest year since instrument recordings were made. 8 warmest years have been since 1998, and the top 14 warmest years have all taken place since 1990. It's important to remember a key thing. If you go home from here and you say, hey, honey or a friend or whomever, I learned a lot about global warming today, and they say the temperature is increasing and it's going to go up maybe 2 degrees and then maybe 8 degrees in 100 years. Somebody will say, well, wait a second, it changed 15 degrees from when you woke up this morning to the evening. Why would that matter? Right? I say, let's not make that mistake. There's a huge difference between the weather and the climate, right? There's similarities. But the weather is this fluctuating thing that we deal with every day. We put coats on and off, bathing suits on in the summer, what have you. But the climate, we're talking about global temperature averages. And when you talk that, then you say, well, an 8-degree difference from the global average of today, 8 degrees Fahrenheit cooler, had Manhattan under 2 miles of ice in the last ice age. That's different than weather, whether you like Manhattan or not. And conversely, 8 degrees warmer when you're talking about the climate floods our beautiful coastlines of Florida, puts them underwater. So some faraway stuff, and then I'll bring it home. We funded at Greenpeace an effort. 2 explorers came to us and they said, we're going to be the first ever to go to the North Pole unassisted in the summer. And we're going to show the meltdown. So we connected them with a great US ice agency that measures all this stuff through satellites. And we helped outfit these guys who were pulling canoes. That was kind of their sleds. But then when the water opened up, they could get in the canoes and paddle them. And they were wearing these amphibious suits. So they were literally falling into the ocean, swimming, pulling through ice, to get to the North Pole to show how dramatically this is melting down. We were going to have them picked up by one of our big ships, the Arctic Sunrise. It's an ice class ship. It can sort of break through ice. And so we put out a call for scientists. We said, any scientists want to go up around and look around Greenland? Any scientific needs up there? And you should know this is the way many of you who are scientists know this. Scientists will sort of hitch a ride on any useful vessel. And one of the reasons we know so much about the Antarctic is that the US military does a lot of work down there. And they regularly have scientists on board. So it's actually a very useful thing. There's not considered to be that much of national import going on around Greenland. So there's very little on-the-ground work done in Greenland. So when this Greenpeace icebreaker was going, 2 climatologists from the University of Maine said, we're coming. Because we've been studying I think it's the largest glacier on Greenland, the Kangerlussuaq Glacier. It drains 3% of that continent. Now, one of the things about Greenland that climate scientists look at is they look at it rather nervously. And they say, when the ice on Greenland, because it's not green, it's white, when the ice on Greenland melts, seas are going to come up considerably, like 20 to 30 feet. Right? So they look at the pace of the melting there. So these 2 scientists went with Greenpeace, and we have a little tiny helicopter on the back of this Greenpeace ship. It's called Tweety. It can fit 4 people, but it's so little, it makes it quite useful for these scientists, because on a military vessel, the helicopter would be bigger. It has other uses. Ours is just to move activists around, and sometimes to film those shots when you see those Greenpeace ships and little boats getting in the way of the exploding harpoons going at the whales, right? The only way to get the image of that is from up here. So little Tweety and the pilot, ironically named Huey, takes the 2 glaciologists, and they have the GPS coordinates saying, here's where we want to go. We want to land on the glacier and put in GPS gear. And then we're going to measure it day by day how fast this stuff moves, because we've been measuring it from the University of Maine using satellite data. They even measure the movement of those things based on a Richter scale. You can feel the rumblings in the planet as these things in the Himalayas are moving around, rattling around. As they go, of course, here's the classic story. The pilot is calling back to him and her, the 2 scientists say, you've given me the wrong coordinates, we're over open ocean. No, we have it exactly right. So these are 2 scientists. They contribute to the IPCC. They're totally involved in this sort of mainstream climate science. They know that their glacier is melting and that it's melting faster. They get geometric rates of change in ways that I don't. And still, they were wrong about where that glacier would be. And they were off by 15 miles. 15 miles. These are like 2 of the smartest experts in the world who understand global warming, whose specialty is that glacier. It had begun to melt 300% faster than had been. 300% faster than had been. So his little aside to me was, if you melt down Greenland, and if you melt down the West Antarctic ice sheet, you raise the world's oceans maybe 70, 80 feet, which floods out every mega city in the world, with the exception of Mexico City and Sao Paulo, because they're inland cities. All right, enough for the optimism. No, it's going to get better. I had a Greenpeace meeting in Switzerland only a week ago, And at the end of it, I snuck off. I hired a Swiss guide and I went and did my life dream, skiing glaciers in the Alps in Switzerland. Glaciers are amazing, amazing things. Here talking about them in Central Florida. They really are fossil remnants of the last ice age. And there I was on something called the Aletsch Glacier, having come down in a wicked, harrowing storm, roped to my guide, skiing in complete blind whiteout conditions around crevasses that only he knew where they were, as he just stared at his compass needle, and he used his poles to feel whether we were moving or not, because you lose all sense when you have nothing around you to see. But you get down to the glacier where you then are going to climb up to a hut. It's a real unusual term. This hut can sleep 150 people. It's supplied by a helicopter. It's actually a wonderful place to stop after 5 hours in a whiteout. But the hut, you go up this set of steel stairs up this cliff from the glacier. The hut in 1877 was 50 meters, it's almost a yard, 50 meters above the glacier. And today it is 120. It's 120. It was one heck of a climb in altitude. 4 feet of snow fell, not conditions you would choose, but conditions you get to brag about that you were in, but also the kind of extreme situation that teaches you something about yourself. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute when I go back to Joseph Campbell. So, local warming. My friend, the poet and mountain guide Jack Turner says, I don't care about the North Pole, John. I don't care about things that are far. I care about where I live. He lives in the Teton National Park. You live in Florida. Greenpeace, when we work, wherever we work on global warming, we talk about the local impact. So when it's Vermont, we talk about their maple trees and their maple syrup industry. In New England, it's about the ski industry. In Colorado, it's about wildfires. In Florida, well, you've heard this stuff this morning. It's about the potential for increased forest fires, saltwater intrusion from sea level rise, storm surges from higher sea level, spread of infectious diseases. These are all things here and now, and potentially supercharged storms. Now, as environmentalists, I've been dipping into this for 15 years. Working on it, I got obsessed with this issue 15 years ago. And the interesting thing was, it was perennial disappointment for us when we ever dealt with Florida. Because we always said, well, Florida, that is the canary in our coal mine. That is the state taking this stuff in the teeth. And then we could never see the political alignment. And many, many, many teams came down here of organizers and different environmental groups. And I have to say that has changed quite dramatically. Not just from what I heard this morning, although that was all quite impressive. And it was after, it seemed after the big storms that chased into Louisiana and Mississippi and Texas, Katrina and Rita, storms that one of your professors reminded me this morning, we can't say definitively that is from global warming. All we can say is the best scientists say a hotter earth, hotter oceans is one of the components to supercharged storms. So you had those storms, and then you had another storm, Storm Al Gore, Hurricane Gore, and his movie, and suddenly the world was different. The world was much different from when I started working on global warming. We would go through the scientific literature, and we would look at things like, well, the Gulf Stream could shut down, and that would put Northern Europe in a deep freeze, and we'd say, we can't talk about that. They already think we're crazy. Let's leave that one alone. Let's just stick to one people can really understand. And that's not the case anymore. There's a robust debate and conversation going on about this issue. So we had these dark 8 years, and we did irreparable damage and harm to our economy, our reputation abroad, made ourselves dependent on undemocratic regimes abroad. But only in our most challenging times do we truly know who we are, and such a time is emerging. So, you know, am I hopeful? Do I know we're going to win? I run Greenpeace. I push all sorts of resources. I push my guys every day. I want to do more, be louder, be more forceful. Turn more congressmen and women on this. How can we can't know though. Back to Joseph Campbell, that mythologist. Instead of it being an individual's challenge from childhood to adulthood, I really think we're in a civilizational challenge. We're in a challenge where we were quite, and the Western or modern civilization has been, despite its great intelligence and discoveries and breakthroughs, has been enormously immature in a lot of ways. We have been an adolescent civilization. And we are now going through one of those tests that determines whether we have the right to enjoy adulthood. I think global warming is that test. Global warming foists this life-threatening challenge on us. That if we pass the test, we get to move from childhood to adulthood. So will we win? I have no idea. But if I was a betting man, let's look what's happening. You heard from the CDC today and how that great agency is focused on this. You read about venture capitalists putting money into this. Companies like Walmart, or investment bankers like Goldman Sachs. Whether you like every aspect of the stuff or not, you've got mayors like your own Mayor Buddy Dyer and your governor, Governor Christ. Just a sidebar, lest I be up here and somebody think I support somebody's nuclear program. Nuclear power is not the answer to this. Do your own research, find it out yourself, but the companies that are lined up for this are looking for massive subsidies for an industry that really has not worked for us, that's completely uneconomic and dangerous and highly coveted waste by terrorists. Particularly when you have choices of distributed power, and the state is becoming a leader in solar, and we're seeing wind around the country. And there's problems with biofuels too. I just want to state that as well. What people hope for is the next generation of biofuels has the potential to be a real important fuel source. The biofuels we have now actually can take more energy to get them into that state than you are saving. So nevertheless, I'm not going to say it's all bad. And you begin to see how quickly you can move to a different fuel. So when you get the right one, you say, wow, you can move quickly. You see a presidential race, we're coming out of the dark era, the dark ages. And you are going to have a time where we have maybe not the greatest environmental leader as our president, but we'll have presidents that listen to us, presidents that are subject to the pressures of our democracy. A president and vice president, we hope, who is subject to public approbation, who can be shamed. This current group had none of that, not because they were Republicans or Democrats, just because this was an accident and a terrible moment in our history, but we're going past that, back to regular people with their strengths and weaknesses like we all have. So we have the solar industry on fire, the wind industry, efficiency and breakthroughs everywhere. Students and campuses focus the nation. You had a big one here, step it up. Something called Power Shift from Energy Action, a large student coalition from around the country, did the largest ever student gathering on global warming outside of DC at the University of Maryland. They came to lobby Congress. This was back in November. 5,000 students. 5,000 students on global warming. It was unheard of 15 years ago. You have different car choices. You have religious leaders, and not just lefty liberal religious leaders. You have very conservative religious leaders talking about global warming. Local public health officials who aren't yet throwing tomatoes. Greene County commissioners, who would have thought of such a thing? In Florida, of all places. This is glorious. Greenpeace, what are we doing on global warming? I made a determination several years ago. I said, we are now coming down to, with all this foment going on in the country, we need a great piece of federal legislation, right? That sends the signal to industry, to the capitalists. they have their rules, right? You've got to file, you've got to stay in good graces of the IRS. There's certain labor laws. There's various laws, right? If you want to create a company, you need one more. You need one that says CO2 emissions are going down. Our entrepreneurs, innovators, they can figure this out, and they can build great industries around this. So Greenpeace has deployed organizers. We're known for our boats and hanging off things and blockading things, and we still do that, and it's a lot of fun, and we train people in nonviolence, and my arrest record's at about at 12, and it'll go up. But we're moving organizers into congressional districts, those of Republicans and Democrats. We don't care. We just want to make sure they're going to advocate the gold standard bill on global warming. Because that is the way, at a national level, you then capture all this energy, and those federal politicians follow you guys. They try to catch up to you guys, and that's the way it works. So that's where we've put our people. We've got people down here in 3 Florida districts. So whole new industries are coming. Dr. Martin Quigley this morning was talking about all sorts of things at a very local level, but at just a beautiful level that affect global warming. So the way I was trained as an economist, you think of classic economic transition here. What you have is people say, it's very easy to look at the costs. You look at the oil industry and the auto industry and you add up all the jobs and you say, you can't get rid of that. We could never afford to get rid of that. You'll destroy the economy, right? Well, people from the horse-drawn carriage industry said the same thing. When the whole thing was moving from a horse-based culture to an automobile, first a train and trolley culture, and then an automobile culture. Imagine what the people in the typewriter industry said. When somebody said, we're going to use personal computers. Computers used to be about this large and about the same color. Giant blue computers. Somebody came along and said, no, we're going to make a small personal computer. And it's going to type and do your banking, and people laughed. And then the Smith Corona people said, no, that's crazy. We have all these people employed in our factories. You'll destroy the economy. But of course, what is unimaginable is the way that thing just ballooned and computers became ubiquitous in our lives. Or telephones. Think of the simple little telephone from the old movies. You crank it and that nice sounding operator gets on there and connects you on some party line, and now we have these things called smartphones, and we're connected around the world and the web. It's almost unimaginable. That is what's going on right now. That kind of quantum change in the way we think about energy. So the way we think about energy currently, the old way, is that, well, our energy, it's underneath some really mean people that are sitting on top of our oil in the Middle East. So we need aircraft carrier fleets, 140,000 troops, 140,000 more security specialists from Blackwater, maybe $3 trillion total to control Iraq, and then ultimately use that to help us control Iran and Syria and Saudi Arabia. So we have the oil for our old style, old way of doing business. Instead, we're moving towards this, using this collective intelligence, the smart people from the University of Central Florida and all around our country, to entrepreneurs and inventors and students to change the way we do this. It is not worth killing people in the Middle East to move our cars. It simply comes down to that. So what to do? How to engage? How do we engage this one great challenge? How do you lean your body against this emerging storm that we call global warming? Well, what I do is I look at the great environmental leaders who came before. If you look at Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, where that came from, ultimately, it was a mythological tale about what would happen when we overused pesticides and our songbirds went quiet. And it was ultimately a very aggressive piece of activism, but it came from this deep love that she had from being a child and walking around and exploring the tide pools of Maine with an aunt of hers. such that when she had forgotten it and got to college and she was sitting there in a freshman or sophomore year biology class, thought she wanted to be a writer. The biology professor, according to Rachel Carson, reawakened the sense of wonder in her. So she had this sense of wonder and an ability with a pen and a love of those tide pools in Maine. John Muir, the great environmentalist and founder of the Sierra Club, felt the same way about the High Sierras. And that love led him to found the Sierra Club and be one of the first great activists in the country on the environment. Aldo Leopold, a worker for the U.S. Forest Service, when we believed that the more deer, the happier the hunters, and what kills deer would be wolves, so to shoot all the wolves would make everybody happy. And he describes one day shooting a wolf, and she looks in his eyes and he sees a bright green fire dying in his eyes. And a connection there is made that made him a great environmental advocate. Or you take Martin Luther King. Everything King spoke about and did and built his activism around was about love. In their training, nonviolence training at Greenpeace, it's 3 days. We push you around, make sure you won't push back, make sure you understand how to behave. The civil rights activists had 6 months of training. They'd go deep on words like the Greek term agape for love. How to have love in your heart for your oppressor, thus making yourself that much stronger in your cause. So I say, find that which you love. So it's not like we just have to invent new cars. As you could hear from Dr. Quigley, there's so many ways at global warming. You find that which you love, and then you see it being harmed. And that inspires you to act. And that enables you to be fully engaged in a fight of this magnitude. And if you're fully engaged in a fight of this magnitude and you're fueled by love, then while there is no guarantee of success, there is a guarantee that you will be filled with that power and that reward that is something akin to grace. I thank you very much. Time for some questions, so I'll do my best to field them from up here until somebody tells me to stop. First, the subsidies question. It's a massive sort of Gordian knot. But if we look at subsidies for oil, tens and tens of millions of dollars. And that doesn't even count special deals in Kazakhstan for Exxon and Chevron. Oh, and that doesn't count that our tax dollars pay for all the highways, which is how you use that oil. So when you start to try to untangle that, you find that, you know, the pennies thrown at wind, for example, or solar, isn't really out of line. In fact, it's still not even enough to help it compete. So when I'm debating my libertarian friends, I say, sure, in theory, let's just have no subsidies. Because I think nuclear is doomed without subsidies. And wind and solar will go on probably as fast growing as they are. But since it's very difficult to get the oil boys' hands out of our tax pockets, I'm all for the different subsidies that are in place now and increasing them for wind and solar. But we should not, nothing's a panacea. And whenever, the times we have fought for wind farms, it's only after they meet all the environmental criteria. You do not want these things in bird flyways. You do not want these things in critical habitat. And there have been some in the past that have been built in such places, and there have been, you know, travesties. And of course, the coal guys who like to fight the wind guys always bring those examples up. Big one out in California, but that has not happened more recently. Aesthetically, I love the way they look. So.
You can clarify what kind of effect will that have on the world's climate, especially here in Florida?
That's a great question. I don't know exactly the degree of warming that is projected, and certainly that is projected locally. But But there are a lot of problems with warming the oceans, which comes from global warming. It's happening faster than we expected. It has a lagged effect from the air warming to the water warming, but it changes currents, it changes food patterns in the ocean, and then ultimately, one of the most devastating things it can do is it leads to coral bloom, algae blooms, but it can also bleach coral, and we've seen massive coral bleaching around the world and in this part of the world as well from warmer oceans.
You know, like plugging everything into a power strip and using the fluorescent bulbs and just doing the things that we can do at our house. How can we start promoting this on a state, national, and even global level?
That's a really great question. And you know, I run Greenpeace and I feel the same way, right? So I'm so glad you asked that. And that's why I emphasize this thing of find that which you love. What do you really care about? Because that's where you're going to have the most energy. That's where you're going to be most convincing. I say, yeah, I'm very proud of Al Gore. I love what he did, even though I was a fierce critic of his when he was vice president for not doing enough then. But what he's done since is fantastic. You know, but I don't know movie makers in California who are going to say, hey, John, I like your slideshow. I'm going to turn that into an award-winning movie. But we don't have to do that. He did that. So what's your part? What's our part? First, you look at your spheres of influence. Well, who do I know? Well, what teachers do I know? What professors? What friends? What clubs are my parents in? What clubs am I in? What interests me? And when you start looking at this, you start thinking sort of like an organizer. And every little thing, every once in a while, little opportunities open. And then you run down that hole, and then you see something else, and then something else. So there's no one thing. I could say, hey, if you want to help with Greenpeace on Project Hot Seat, we're in 3 districts in Florida. We'd like to work with organizers and put pressure on these candidates. But that's not the only way to go. There's all sorts of things. There's going to be students from business schools dealing with entrepreneurs, inventing stuff. There's so many ways at it. And then as you engage, you'll find, oh, here's something I like even better. And here's something I like still more. And here's something I'm even better at. And so it's a very loose answer, I know. I'm not saying do this, join the army, go for it, right? It's nothing that's that simple. Although even the army will do its part one of these days, right? Everybody's going to do their part on how we use energy. But you start with, what do you really care about? What do you really love? What's interesting to you? Are cars interesting to you? Is cooking interesting to you? Is gardening interesting to you? And you can start from these places.
What is the true alternative for fossil fuel energy plants?
There's no one single answer. The key thing on this is, one of the things about the way in some ways, Western education is, we're trained to be so smart. And so whatever problem there is, there's an answer. But on this one, there might be 1,000 answers, right? So Hawaii uses oil to get energy, right? So Hawaii is going to have to use some mix of decreasing amounts of oil, of wind, of solar, of super efficiency, right? The Cape and Islands, Cape Cod up off of Massachusetts, about 70% of the Cape and Islands energy comes from oil. It's unusual. A lot of energy in this country would be coal, hydro, nukes, natural gas, not necessarily in that order. The Cape and Islands uses oil. A lot of island communities use oil. You bring it in with a ship, right? There's a wind farm proposed for that area that would take care of 70% of those oil needs. So it's always different. There's no one answer.
There's been talk and discussion about nukes. Where are you at now?
Well, I have about 180 colleagues who work in China, in Beijing, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and they're fighting this stuff over there. But to be consistent with the answer I gave to the gentleman over here, I can't really affect that much. Yeah, there's foundations over here and wealthy donors, and I have them meet my Chinese colleagues and say, help fund my friends over there. But I say, I'm going to get my country doing the right thing on global warming. And then our entrepreneurs and businesses are going to sell super efficient gear to China so they don't feel the need to burn coal in this very old-fashioned energy source that is going to overwhelm the good changes we make. But we have to lead by example. We got involved, the Bush administration, really led by the oil industry, they tied us up in a knot. They said to Americans, they said, let's not do anything unless those Chinese and Indians do it too. As though somehow we've been put upon by the Chinese, our Chinese and Indian brethren. Somehow we've been put upon. And I was told this by a congressman who I was lobbying to sign on to this gold standard global warming act. And he said, we should do the same thing they do. And I said, Mr. Congressman, you are so right. I completely agree with you. He was a little taken aback. I said, yeah, let's really make it equal with those people. And then he loved my language. And I said, let's do global warming reductions on an equal per capita basis. Well, the amount of carbon dioxide that we emit is about 30 times greater than the average Chinese, about 60 times greater than the average Indian. And numbers may be a little bit off. I read them a while ago, but it's a huge difference. What I'm saying is, if emerging countries like India and China go a lot slower than us, as they're trying to keep these fast-growing economies going and pull people out of poverty, trust me, we're not being put upon. We're not paying a penalty for all the CO2 emissions we put up there in the industrialized world since the Industrial Revolution. There's equity and then there's real equity. So we really need to go in this country and set the example. That's the only way it's going to work. The politicians are going to have to figure out the compromise, though, to your particular question, through the international agreements.
I've heard you mention ocean turbines, and I just wonder how Greenpeace looks at ocean turbines and their ability to do electrical power generation.
By ocean turbines, do you mean things that capture energy from the wave motion? When I said there's got to be 1,000 answers, that's on one of them. One of my best friends from when I grew up. We played on a Little League team in the 3rd grade. He is running a company that sells buoys that sit out there and capture energy from wave motion. There are so many ways to do this, and I'm not an engineer. There's so many brilliant ways, particularly for people who are near the coast, that will be smarter than spending $3 trillion in Iraq. So thank you for mentioning that one.
How do we convince the countries that have most of the sovereignty to change from a mindset of sovereignty to stewardship?
But certainly that has been the theme of just extracting more and more and more from the land. Ultimately, even though I like to beat up on our governments, I like to beat up on our corporations, it's part of my job running Greenpeace, these things are reflections of us. And as we change in our hearts, and we change in our desire not to dominate and destroy the land and then move on, but then choose to nurture it, our governments will slowly, very slowly, I believe, follow us as we demand that they do.
The Caspian Sea, is that being tapped into now, and how might that interconnect with our policies towards Iran?
I don't know about the oil in the Caspian Sea in particular. The oil, the largest easily accessible, largest supply of easily accessible oil in the world is in the Mideast, is under the Mideast. And no matter what they tell you about wanting to bring democracy to Iraq, the reason we are in Iraq is to control that region. And the moral issues aside, the human carnage aside, there's just smarter ways to get energy. Smarter ways to get energy. This was just the most horrific experiment that we have deployed, that this country has deployed in recent memory.
About a gold standard federal legislation or bill, are you referring to any particular?
Yes, Henry Waxman introduced something called the Safe Climate Act. Now, even that, the science on this is moving so fast that even that is not enough. So there's talk about there's going to be some amendments to it or something's going to be reintroduced. Senators Boxer and Sanders, Boxer from California, Sanders from Vermont, had the equivalent bill in the Senate. Unfortunately, a bill by Senators Lieberman and Warner was introduced instead. That's going to give us a good debate on global warming, but it's not the answer. It's just not enough. It gives up to $1 trillion away to the biggest polluters. We will fight that. That will not be the law of the land. But the fact that we're debating this in the US Senate, while it seems awfully late to me, having started 15, 18 years ago on this, it's a blessing to see this debate going on now and the public beginning to demand that the answers come.
So I graduated college in '88, and I went to MIT, and we had a guy there named James Hansen who built solar cars, and he raced them all over the world. He raced them across this country, up and down, so east to west, north to south. Went to Australia, took it right through the desert north to south in a solar car race. There's a solar car team from every major engineering university. Kids build these things with some money from corporations, but mostly these are roughly $10,000 devices. And I said, this is really great. I'm really excited about this. When I grow up, I'm going to have a solar car. Where's my solar car? What happened to that whole idea? And by this time, he got hired by Ford. But I haven't seen Ford produce a solar car. What's going on with that?
Who has seen the movie Who Killed the Electric Car? All right, you've got to watch that movie, okay? Because there's a documentary. It's very funny, but it's also very sad. Who Killed the Electric Car? And it's about an electric car that Ford Motor Company rolls out. They get these smart young engineers and they work on it, and people have them and they love them. And then Ford realizes, this is really just a little scam. We just kind of did this. We've got to get rid of these. Was it GM? It wasn't Ford. Ford had an electric truck, and GM had the car in this movie. You are right. Thank you for correcting me. Thank you for correcting me. So who killed the electric car? So these guys didn't want to do it yet because they were making too much money pretty much selling SUVs. The GM Suburban, do I have the right company with brand? They would make a $10,000 profit margin on that. And they weren't making that on that electric car. I don't know that our future in this is going to be based on these 3 lumbering, dying companies. But I do know that with all the smart people out there and the way the internet works and the way information moves around, I don't know how it works with that kind of infrastructure because it costs a lot of money to build a car, right? But I do see these guys, these companies, these sort of centralized behemoths that sort of squished change out of the way as being a dying breed. And I know there's hope in that. I don't know really where we're going to get that electric or solar car, but I'm hopeful too. Because I know my little hybrid isn't the whole answer. It's just a little baby step in the right way.
I was just wondering if you could clarify for me what you meant when you said the spirituality of taking a stance on global warming.
Yes, thank you for asking that. If you just dive into this because you're pissed off at Ford or GM or Exxon, and I've done that. I had my Greenpeace team do a full-on peaceful invasion of ExxonMobil's headquarters the day before one of their annual meetings. We had 2 disguises. One was the Exxon tiger suits, right? So the security guards just let them in. They thought it was part of some thing. And then suits, right? At Greenpeace is a suit, a disguise, right? To look like the Exxon guys. And they went in. But ultimately spiritual, because it has to be rooted in love, because ultimately it's you engage it because your heart tells you to, not because you know you will win, because you may win, you may not win. Whether you win or lose may not even be known in our own lifetimes. Those are all things that are sort of about more of the heart and the spirit. And I include those in a list of things such that if you're inclined to that, I will have said it. But if you're not, I just talked about politics and technology, right? And that's okay. But I believe there's a very powerful spiritual element, and the older I get, the more important that becomes to me. But for those for whom that is not important, and it needn't be important to everyone, it can just slip away. But I think it's a powerful, powerful piece.
When you talked about the glacier in Greenland and it being 15 miles inland and the ocean being where the helicopter was, it reminded me that things need to ramp up a bit. And is it that the Fords and GMs and the infrastructure, they're hanging on to their capital costs, and there may be a mindset change in the business environment, and the investment community is also what is needed? Because it sounds like, you know, if we wait 10, 15 years for hydrogen or alternative technologies to come along, we may have waited too long to really ramp up the change that we need to do.
Yes, wonderful point. We absolutely do. Yes, the industrialists are trying to sort of fully amortize the investment they have in their plants, right? And some of the energy companies are trying to do the same thing with old coal plants, and they try to do the same thing with old nuclear plants. Just squeeze out another 5, another 10 years. It's not really our problem, it's somebody else's problem. And back to that Dr. James Hansen, he said about 2 years ago that he believes, and it's not scientific, even though he's a great scientist, he said, in my gut, I think we have about 10 years to sort of get these CO2 emissions under control in order to avert the most catastrophic impacts from global warming. So I think you're right. I think that's it. Thank you all very much.